gladiatorskih bojev. Drugače pa se je izobraževal na Univerzi v Trentu, potem je bil podoktorski raziskovalec na Univerzi v Helsinki, v projektu Prenova temeljev evropske pravne kulture med leti 1934 in 1964. Nadalje je bil gostujoči raziskovalec na Univerzi v Heidelbergu in sedaj je profesor na Univerzi v Trentu. Ves čas svojega delovanja je zelo vpet v na mednarodnem področju. Teme, ki jih je predaval, so rimsko pravo v evropski zgodovini, potem italijansko pravo, pravo, totalitarizem in človekove pravice, rimski temelji evropskega prava in rimsko kazensko pravo in kazenska zakonodaja v starem Rimu. Se pravi, gre za zelo širok spekter vseh vprašanj v zvezi z pravo v antiki. Tokrat pa nam bo predstavil družbeni in pravni položaj gladiatorjev v antičnem Rimu.
Thank you. So thank you very much. First of all, please let me thank the president of the Slovenian Academy, all the members, and Professor Janec Kranjec for this kind invitation. I would like also to thank all people who are present here to attend my lecture. It is a great honor. It's really an honor for me to be here and to have the opportunity to give this lecture before this audience. Today I will deal with the topic of gladiatorial spectacles, games or spectacles or combats, and so also with the condition of social and legal conditions of gladiators in ancient Rome. So a kind of research that has to do with my recent research and with one of my last publications. Gladiatorial games were officially known as munera gladiatoria in ancient Rome and played a very important role from the end of the 3rd century BC until the beginning of late antiquity, when they eventually and gradually became obsolete. For centuries, ancient gladiatorial combats provided entertainment and excitement in Roman social life. In the Amphitheatrum Flavium alone, over 300,000 people died between 70 and 438 AD. Gladiatorial combats thus represent one of the most fascinating and sometimes also disturbing aspects of Roman culture and Roman society. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe already reported with horror on his visit to the Colosseum in his Italienische Reise. So, quote, but when, it's my translation, of course, of the original quote from Goethe, but when I approached the sublime remains of the Colosseum and looked through the bars into its closer interior, I cannot deny that the shiver ran through me and hastened my return. End of quote. Despite the immense popularity of gladiatorial games, the legal and social status of their protagonists, the gladiators, was ambivalent. On the one hand, they were discriminated against and subject to the so-called infamia, meaning they lost their position of honor and were barred from holding public office. As people with limited legal status, gladiators stood at the very margins of society, on a par with some criminals, pimps, actors performing the so-called ars ludicra, and prostitutes. On the other hand, they adorned the walls of houses in Roman streets as graffiti, and the best gladiators became popular with the masses. In any case, there are literary accounts, for example by Cicero and Livy, which also paint an elitist picture of gladiators, stylizing their behavior in the arena as a model for the Roman ideal of virtus. But this ideal applied mainly the Republican period and usually had to do with young nobles who wanted to fight for free. The tension between contempt and exclusion on one hand, and admiration and idealization on the other, resulted in a contradictory reputation for gladiators and an ambivalent position within Roman society, which was described by the church father Tertullian around 200 AD as perversitas, a typical perversion of Roman society. As Tertullian wrote, and I quote here the text, the end of the text, just referring to the end of the text that you can see there on the slide, the perversity of it, quanta perversitas, the perversity of it. They love whom they lower, they despise whom they approve. The art, they glorify, the artist they disgrace. What sort of judgment is this, that a man should be blackened for what he shines in? Yes, and what a confession that things are evil when their authors at the top of their popularity are in disgrace. So there is this kind of tension, there is this kind of criticism in Tertullian. Anyway, the political significance of gladiatorial combat is assessed very differently by ancient authors and in modern studies and works. According to the famous phrase coined by sharp-tongued Roman satirist Juvenal, all that was needed to integrate the politically disempowered Roman population of the imperial era, socially and politically, was panem et circenses, so bread and games. According to Juvenal and other classical Roman authors, the expansion and institutionalization of state grain donations, gladiatorial games, and other circus spectacula became an integral part of the political system of the Roman Empire and served to stabilize its structure. With the development of the Principate form of government, libertas, and with it the opportunity of the Roman citizens and populations for political participation were lost for good. The plebs urbana, according to Juvenal, relinquished their right to political participation and exchanged it for the desire for entertainment. Yet, if we look at other classical authors, the depiction is a bit different. For example, in the case of Cicero. According to Cicero, there were 3 key places where the people could communicate their political opinions and judgments and become politically active. At the consultative informal election assemblies of the Roman people, the so-called conciones, at the decision-making popular assemblies, the so-called comitia, and at the gatherings in the theater and gladiatorial combats, as Cicero wrote, ludorum gladiatorumque concessu. The equation of 2 venerable institutions of the Roman state, ancient state of the Roman Republic, with spectacles and gladiatorial combats, underlines the high social and political relevance of the latter and stands in direct contradiction to Juvenal's accusation of depoliticization through panem et circenses. But Cicero, we have to keep in mind that Cicero wrote before the beginning of the Principate, and the assessment of gladiatorial games changed from the time of the Republic to the imperial period. One cannot forget, in any case, that the organization of gladiatorial games, especially in the Republican period, was a powerful tool available to the men of noble Roman families to promote their popularity, prestige, and political careers. But first of all, talking about gladiatorial spectacles, first question arises, and namely, where did gladiatorial combat originate? Well, originating from Samnite burial rituals in honor of deceased nobles, the first munera gladiatoria took place in Rome in the 3rd century BC. Although some historians and Roman law scholars have suggested that gladiatorial combats originated in Etruria, but I am not entirely convinced by this view. I really believe they originated from Samnium, so from the Samniti. The first munus in Rome, as far as we know, took place in 264 BC at the funeral of Decimus Junius Brutus Pera. Pera was a respected senator, and the sons of the deceased had organized 3 duels between prisoners of war who fought in his honor in a public square, the Forum Boarium, on the Tiber. Gladiatorial combat quickly gained popularity after that, and its scale and cost steadily increased. Since the festivities represented a politically significant opportunity to enhance their public image, the magistrates organizing the events increasingly paid for very rich and elaborate games out of their own pockets. In 105 BC, the Senate included the munera gladiatoria in the list of public spectacles alongside the ludi circenses. But as the sacred and religious significance of gladiatorial combat gradually receded, the nature of these spectacles partly changed and a new type of event developed, which was increasingly used by its organizer, the so-called editor, to display his wealth and in return to obtain various advantages. Under Augustus, the Munera Gladiatoria became a carefully staged mass spectacle and an integral part of the ruling practice of the Principate. Augustus' successors, up to Emperor Trajanus, increased the number and scope of the events and increased the number of gladiators fighting and wild animals killed during these spectacles. Nevertheless, several emperors attempted to keep the cost of gladiatorial games under control, because this was another problem, the cost of the Munera Gladiatoria. Around 22 BC, Augustus himself enacted a series of measures concerning both the Munera Gladiatoria and the Ludi Circenses in order to limit expenditure. He decreed that a munus could only be organized with the prior approval of the Senate, that no more than 2 gladiatorial games could be organized per year, and that no more than 120 gladiators could compete in these fights. Well, 120 gladiators is a high number, but still, this was the limit imposed by Augustus. The problem of the cost of the Munera Gladiatoria was therefore already becoming pressing at the time of Augustus. Tiberius pursued Augustus' policy on this matter with even greater determination. At the time of Claudius decided to address the issue of cost of gladiatorial spectacles. With a Senate decree in 41 AD, he abolished the mandatory editio, so the organization of the Munera Gladiatoria by the praetors, which had been introduced by Augustus. However, from 47 AD onwards, the task was transferred to the quaestors, who were to organize the gladiatorial combat annually at their own expenses. Incidentally, this emperor's attitude, so Claudius' attitude, was rather ambiguous. While he tried to carve the cost of gladiatorial games, Claudius did not hesitate to offer very rich and expensive Munera Gladiatoria himself. In line with a trend that seemed irreversible, the cost of organizing these events continued to rise during Nero's reign. It was not until Domitian that a new measure was introduced to control the expenditure of the imperial coffers. Anyway, all these measures were not effective. Sorry, I forgot to move the slide, and I'm very sorry for that. So, as you can see, the average cost of an event in the Italian peninsula in the 2nd century AD, so later than the time of Nero, Claudius, Nero, and Domitian, was approximately 50,000 sestertia. And in the Italian peninsula, according to the study and the research by Duncan Jones. So the cost was very high. This was the average cost. But we know from epigraphic inscriptions that some munera could cost 200,000 sestertia, for example. A very, very high cost, so sum of money. And so Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Commodus were somehow forced to enact another measure to curb cost due to the rising expenses of gladiatorial games. This new provision was taken by the two principes in 177 or 178 at the latest, AD. This new provision, taken by the two emperors, so we know this new provision thanks to an epigraphic inscription, but the epigraphic inscription actually contains the prima sententia, so the opening speech of the discussion held in the Senate on the Oratio Principum, on the Oratio by Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Commodus, and this Oratio had the intent of reducing the cost of gladiatorial games. As I said, the prima sententia has been preserved in an epigraphic inscription known as the Ais Italicense, the bronze of Italica. This is the bronze that you can find, you can see at the Museo Archeologico Nacional in Madrid. If you go there, you can find this wonderful piece of bronze in which there are more than 63 lines inscribed. But it's not complete because one of the tables has been lost. At least one of the tables has been lost. The prima sententia not only set a precisely defined price for individual gladiators, but also regulated the costs of the various types of munera gladiatoria. It abolished the vectiga, so the tax that the owner of a gladiator school and the gladiator merchant, the so-called lanista, would have had to pay to the fiscus, and among other things, specified exactly which magistrates and imperial officials should be responsible for enforcing the newly introduced rules. Unfortunately, it is not known with certainty whether this new measure was ultimately effective and successful. And these are the costs of the gladiators and the cost of gladiatorial spectacles. So the Ars Italicense was the first measure to take into consideration both the cost of the single gladiators and the cost of the gladiatorial spectacles in general. And as you can see, the cost of gladiators are divided into several levels, and they have to refer to the cost of the different types of gladiatorial spectacles. So the idea was trying to limit the general, so the expenditure for the organization of the spectacles, first of all. But in order to do that, it was necessary to limit the prices of the gladiators, because in some cases in the past, previously than this measure was taken, it happened that the cost of the gladiatorial spectacles were somehow limited, but the cost of the gladiators were not limited. So it was very difficult to organize a proper gladiatorial spectacle if not enough gladiators were available to the organizer, the so-called editor. So, in general, on the subject of the various imperial interventions that followed one another, it can be said that they almost always proved ineffective because they were inorganic and could not effectively tackle the root of the problem. Although the prices for gladiators and munera gladiatoria were reduced or somehow limited, the obligations to organize gladiatorial combats, which in any case weighed heavily on the magistrates, the curiones, and the priests of some provinces of the empire, like the case of the priest of the Gallie, would have exposed them, so the magistrates, the curiones, and the priests, would have exposed them to the risk of jeopardizing their economic resources, especially during the crises, wars, and famines that became very frequent in the Roman Empire from the 2nd century AD onwards. So a successful solution was never actually found, but the problem resolved itself in late antiquity with the gradual obsolescence of the munera gladiatoria. Until then, the real obstacle faced by any princeps who wanted to reduce the cost of gladiatorial games was their immense popularity with the people. And at the same time, gladiatorial combat, as I already mentioned, served at times as a real instrument of political propaganda and consensus building, both for the magistrates and local elites, and for the princeps, for the emperor himself. When the Emperor Constantine the Great eventually enacted an imperial constitution in 325 AD, a constitution that we can find in the Codex Theodosianus, 15th book, title 12, the first constitution of the title. So the intention of the emperor was not to abolish the gladiatorial spectacles, but rather convert the condemnation to fight as gladiators into a condemnation to forced labor in the mines, the so-called damnatio ad metalla. And although some Roman law scholars would like to interpret this imperial constitution as an indirect way of abolishing the munera gladiatoria, it should not be forgotten that only 5 years later, the same Constantine issued the so-called Rescript of Spello. And with the Rescript of Spello, Constantine guaranteed the right of the city of Spello to organize and retain its own gladiatorial spectacles. So gladiatorial combats in the Roman Empire continued to be organized for some time in the 4th century AD, still in the 4th century AD, precisely because of their popularity with the population of the empire, until finally the general feeling of the new era, influenced on the one hand by the rise of Christianity and on the other by Stoic philosophy, led to a different approach to the munera gladiatoria, which could no longer enjoy the favor they had received in earlier times. Nevertheless, another constitution preserved in the Codex Theodosianus, namely Codex Theodosianus 948, dated 365 AD and attributed to the emperors Valentinian and Valens, attests that gladiatorial games were still being organized at that time. In summary, it is likely that these spectacles retained their vitality throughout the 4th century AD, at least on the Italian peninsula, in Africa, and in the eastern part of the empire. And if we compare the Codex Theodosianus and the Codex Repetite Praelectionis by Justinian, it is pretty clear that in the Codex Theodosianus, 15th book, title 12, we can read De Gladiatoribus. This is the title, the rubric of the title 12. It means it deals with the gladiators. So the Codex Theodosianus still contained rules and constitutions on gladiators, whereas the Codex Repetite Praelectionis, in particular 11th book, 44th title, the title reads De Gladiatoribus Penitus Tollendis. So they were eliminated, they were cancelled, abolished, better, abolished by Justinian. In any case, I would like now to move on and spend some words about the condition of the different types of gladiators. So, who were the gladiators, first of all? Gladiators were highly specialized fighters, and they had to be carefully selected and trained. To ensure a steady supply for the munera in Rome, Domitianus established 4 state-run gladiator barracks which were administered by imperial magistrates. The largest of these, the so-called Ludus Magnus, was located directly next to the Colosseum and was connected to it by a passageway so that the gladiators could reach the arena directly from their quarters. The laniste, so the entrepreneurs and merchants who normally owned the gladiators and traded in them, had to invest a certain amount of money to acquire gladiators, pay and provide for trainers, doctors, guards, and other staff, and maintain the buildings. Gladiatorial combats were man-to-man contests in which spectators focused on the fighters' combat techniques, tactics, and feints. Combats between gladiators of equal strength with standardized equipment, so the so-called armature, such as Traex against Murmillo, or Murmillo against Oplomachus, or Secutor against Retiarius, were the most popular with the audience. So, first of all, the first kind of gladiators were the prisoners of war. So the prisoners of war were very popular, of course, and they dominated the scene in the Republican time, usually wearing their traditional armor. And so the Gaul, the Samnite, the Thracian became the archetype of the gladiator. But in addition to prisoners of war, free men could also fight for free to prove their virtue and courage at the time of the Republic and in the first period of the Principate. In the imperial period, this category of fighters, so free men who wanted to fight for free, had almost completely disappeared. Partly because all free men who wanted to fight voluntarily suffered the loss of honor, the infamia. Thus, during the imperial period, the bulk of fighters was made up of slaves fit for military service, who were prisoners of war, convicted criminals, the damnati ad ludum and the damnati ad gladium that I mentioned there, and volunteers who fought for money, the so-called auctorati, so the second group. So with regard to the prisoners of war, it can be said that the Romans watched as the subjugated fought each other, and in their eyes this made their superiority visible and reproduced their military victory. From the organizers' point of view, prisoners of war had the advantage that they were already trained in combat and needed less time before they were ready for the arena. However, during some periods of the Principate, prisoners of war were far from sufficient to meet the demand for fighters. For this reason, convicted criminals became increasingly important for the laniste and the organizers of gladiatorial combats. So, who were these criminals, the damnati ad ludum and the damnati ad gladium? They were servi pene. So these individuals had committed serious crimes, such as murder or cattle theft. Cattle theft, abigeatus, was considered a very serious offense in some provinces of the empire. And during the imperial period, these criminals were called servi pene. And what is a servus or a serva pene? So, according to the great historian, legal historian Theodor Mommsen, so Mommsen wrote in his Strafrecht, 1899, that, well, I quoted him in German, but so unlike other slaves belonging to the state, legal scholars refer to him, so to the servus pene, as a penal slave, servus pene. This means that he is separated from his family and his marital relations. His possession falls to the state along with his person, confiscation of property, and from then on is incapable of owning property or disposing of it among the living in his will. End of quote. Penal slavery, also known in English as slavery of punishment, according to the definition given by William Warwick Buckland. So penal slavery differs from other known forms of slavery in ancient Rome, because in the case of this slavery itself was not the specific punishment for the convicted person, but it was simply a side effect of the condemnation to a capital punishment. And we have to keep in mind that capital punishment in Rome did not only mean death penalty. For capital punishment, we mean a kind of punishment that led either to the loss of liberty or to death. The convicted person, therefore, became a servus, a serva, pene, only as a legal consequence of a specific punishment. And in several cases, these kind of convicts were also put to death, but not necessarily. So the status of servus pene has been discussed a lot among scholars, and it represented a specific, peculiar condition. And I do not wish to go into details of this legal institution that is really pretty specific of Roman criminal law. Anyway, it is interesting to see that some servi pene were used as gladiators. And in particular, the damnati ad ludum and the damnati ad gladium. So, who were the damnati ad ludum and the damnati ad gladium? There is a source, it's not the only source dealing with them, but this is perhaps the most important also because this source was not interpolated, of course, at the time of Justinian, so because this is a source coming from the Collatio Legum Mosaicarum et Romanarum. And the last part of this text, that is also reported in the digest, but with a lot of modification, okay? This last part describes the difference between the damnati ad ludum and the damnati ad gladium. So, the damnati ad ludum represented a group of convicts who had to live and fight as gladiators for their entire lives or for a specific and usually very long period of time. They were usually young people who were convicted to this kind of punishment. And the damnati ad ludum could also hope for the emperor's mercy or to be released from the gladiator life by the spectators after proving their value during the fights in the arena. In particular, as we can read, they could obtain the pileus after 5 years, or after 3 years, they could obtain the rudis. So these are the two last lines. And the pileus gave them a kind of total freedom from gladiatorial life, but they did not get back freedom, liberty, because they were anyway servi pene. They remained servi pene. It's a specific condition of this kind of convicts. But anyway, they were free to go away, to leave the gladiatorial life. So after 3 years or 5 years. The other, well, it must be noted, by the way, that even if they could be, they could leave the gladiatorial life after 3 or 5 years, it must be noted that they released gladiators had little or no chance of being integrated into society, and therefore they often wanted to fight again as gladiators voluntarily and for money. So they wanted to come back and to make the life of gladiator as their job, if I can express myself in this way. So the damnati ad gladium, instead, they were also condemned to fight in the arena as gladiators, although some legal historians think otherwise, but I think it's pretty clear from this source and other sources. And they were different, so there was a difference between the damnati ad ludum and the damnati ad gladium, because the damnati ad gladium had to fight in the arena, but if they were able to survive the fights, the combats, they were killed by the sword within a year of their final definitive condemnation. Thus, this condemnation was a special form of capital punishment that had to be carried out within a maximum of 1 year. In the period between the sentence and the final execution of the condemnation, however, the condemned had to fight as gladiators, and of course, they were not expensive. They costed less than other kinds of gladiators. So both prisoners of war and convicts had one thing in common anyway. So the prisoners of war that we have seen before, and the damnati ad gladium and the damnati ad ludum. So they were forced to fight in the arena. Nevertheless, there are also men who voluntarily choose to serve as gladiators in exchange for a sum of money. And these men were the so-called auctorati, that I mentioned also before. So the second group, the auctorati. And the auctorati were also mentioned in the Bronze of Italica. They committed themselves to serving for a fixed period of time or a certain number of fights. But how were these men able to commit themselves to this life? This is a very difficult question because we do not have many sources that provide us with information about the auctorati. Anyway, some legal historians, some historians believe that the auctoratus had to sign a kind of contract with the lanista, with the merchant of gladiators. However, I think that if we have a look at the sources, for example, the Satyricon by Petronius, I mentioned two parts of the Satyricon taken from the Satyricon, or the Epistole by Seneca, and some other sources, I think that we can conclude that the mutual obligation between the fighter and the lanista, so the merchant of gladiators, arose from the oath that the fighter had to take. And this oath was known as auctoramentum. In front of witnesses, the future gladiator took the following oath. I promise that I accept to be branded, put in chains and killed with the sword. So we can see in Seneca, Uri, the fourth line, auctoramenti verba sunt, Uri, vinciri, ferroque necari. And if we have a look at the Satyricon, 117.5, in verba eumolpi sacramentum iuravimus, Uri vinciri, verberari, ferroque necari, et quid aliud, eumolpus iusisset. So, and any other kind of thing that eumolpus, the master, will order us to do, to perform. The oath was the legal basis for an obligation between the two parties. The auctoratus undertook to fight in the arena and agreed to submit to the lanista and follow his orders, while the lanista undertook to pay the sum of money to accept and train the auctoratus in the gladiator group, and also to pay the funeral expenses in the event of the auctoratus' death. I also mentioned another part of the Satyricon, the last one, just to remember that the auctorati were free men. Because if we look at this sentence, the last sentence was pronounced by Corax, the mercenarius Corax, so mercenary, who affirmed, nec minus liber sum quam vos. He is referring to the people who took the oath and became auctorati. And he says, nec minus liber sum quam vos. So, I am free, like you are free, as you are free. So, he is affirming that the auctorati are free, okay, and is not less free than the auctorati. So, the oath of the auctoratus was very similar to the military oath, the so-called auctoramentum or sacramentum militiae. Although the auctorati were free men who had voluntarily decided to become gladiators, after taking the oath, they were completely subject to the power of the lanista, just like all the other gladiators who were slaves or convicts. For this reason, the lanista could rent out all the gladiators, whether they were free men, slaves, or convicts, to the organizer, the editor, or the munera gladiatoria, and the auctoratus himself was treated as an object, as a res, even though from a purely legal perspective, he had not lost his freedom. This was a special situation that prompts us to reflect on the Roman conception of person. Of course, because in ancient Rome, free people, as we all know, were separated from slaves, who were things, who were res. But in certain cases, free people could also be treated as things. In the case of the auctoratus, the oath in the name of both the gods and the lanista was the means that entitled the lanista to train, punish, and rent out a free man by using a contract of letting and hiring, a so-called locatio rei, as we can argue from the text by the jurist Gaius and contained in his Institutiones, third commentary, third book, paragraph 146. Finally, I would like to briefly address the issue of civic and legal disabilities affecting the category of the so-called auctorati. Well, in general, the gladiators, and then specifically the civic disabilities that affected the auctorati, because in general, gladiators suffered infamia, the legal disgrace. And so, and if they were slaves or convicts, of course, they were not allowed to act in a trial, to be witnesses in criminal, usually to be witnesses in criminal trials, and so on. But focusing on the auctorati, because the auctorati were the free men, we can immediately understand that they were put in a very, very peculiar situation. I just mentioned a few sources, of course, because there is a lot of sources, but I didn't want to reproduce all the sources in my slides. But to begin with, I decided to mention the Tabula Heracleensis and the Tabula Larinas. In these two sources, the terms auctoratus and auctoramentum are expressly mentioned. As for the Tabula Heracleensis, according to a section of the law dating to 45 BCE, a number of subjects, including the auctoratus, as we can read in line 112 and following, the first text that I wrote there, these subjects, including the auctoratus, were excluded from municipal magistracies and from the decurionate. We can also infer from line 121 and following that these subjects were affected by ignominia. That was the first step towards infamia. The Tabula Larinas, that contains the text of the decree of the Senate enacted in 19 AD, confirms the ignominia as a consequence of both fighting as gladiators and becoming an auctoratus in line 12. It's the second text. 11 and 12. This information is important, the information that we can take from the Tabula Larinas, with regard to gladiators in general, because it shows that the social perception of the gladiators had already changed at that time, in 19 AD. So it had changed from the final period of the Republic, final era of the Republic, to 19 AD. Because, as I said before, free men, even those belonging to noble families, who wanted to fight for free as gladiators, were still considered favorably at the end of the Republic or at the very, very, very beginning of the Principate, as we can infer, for example, by reading Suetonius, Augustus 43:4. In this case, Suetonius talks of free men belonging to noble families who decided to fight virtutis causa. And so just a few years later, the situation had changed. Moreover, if a free person decided to fight for money and thus received the questus, the money, the consequence was the legal stigma of infamia. It was the immediate consequence. It is no coincidence that the same sum of money received by the auctorati, in the case of the auctorati, was called questus infamis, as we can infer, for example, from a text by Livy. The Tabula Larinas, lines 7 and following, also contains another provision that led to powerful consequences deriving both from performing as actors and from fighting in the arena as gladiators. In particular, senators, knights, and other members of their family circle who had decided to become actors or gladiators in violation of the prohibitions introduced by the provisions contained in the Tabula Larinas itself had to be punished, and they lost the right to a dignified burial and proper funeral rites. And the Tabula Larinas in some ways also refers to other provisions already enacted in 67 BC through the enactment of the Lex Roscia Theatrali. So according to these provisions of the Lex Roscia Theatralis, some subjects, for example actors, but not only actors, gladiators and so on, were not allowed to sit in the front rows of theaters and amphitheaters, for example. And we can now have a quick look at two texts taken from the Collatio Legum Mosaicarum et Romanarum. And these two texts deals with different topics. The first fragment is taken from the Liber Singularis de Adulteriis by Paul, and it deals, of course, with the provisions on adultery, whereas the second text, Collatio Legum 922, is taken from the 9th book, the Officio Proconsulis of Ulpian. Of course, the Officio Proconsulis is so on the office of the governor, or the provincial governor, And this text deals with the provisions of the Lex Iulia de vi publica et privata, so a lex enacted by Augustus around 17 BC that regulated the very, very severe crime of violence, both public and private violence. In both sources, a list of subjects is mentioned, and among them there are also the auctorati. So they are mentioned in this text. The auctorati are never mentioned in the text that we find in the Codex Justinianus, Repetite Prelectionis by Justinian, or in the Digest, because as I said before, Justinian abolished gladiatorial spectacles, gladiatorial combats, and all the texts that referred to auctorati or gladiators were deeply interpolated or modified. So the auctoratus in the case dealt with by Paulus, so in the first text, is considered liable to be killed by the husband or the adulterer if caught in the act by virtue of the ius occidendi, so the right to kill, even if the auctoratus was a filius familias. So in this text, the jurist equates the auctoratus with a slave and with someone who has rented out his opere, so his activities, to fight wild beasts in the arena. So the auctoratus is equated to slaves and to the so-called bestiari, the person who decided to rent out his work to fight wild beasts in the arena. In the second fragment, the fragment by Ulpian, instead there is a detailed list of subjects who cannot testify against the accused, according to the provisions of the Lex Iulia de vi publica et privata. The auctoratus is included in this list of subjects, and then we can have a quick look at the text by Callistratus. This text by Callistratus, the Juris Callistratus, taken from the work by Callistratus De Cognitionibus, is a text that analyzes the provisions of the Lex Iulia de vi publica et privata. Again, so the same topic analyzed in the text that we saw just a few seconds ago, taken from the Collatio Legum. In this text, Callistrato analyzes the provisions of the Lex Iulia concerning the subjects who did not have the right to testify against the accused, and in this text there is no reference to the auctorati, because as I said before, these texts were interpolated, because it's the same part, it's the same problem, it's the same topic, but there is no reference anymore to the auctorati. Another example of interpolations can be found in another text, that is Digest 4824 Principium, taken from the work by the jurist Ulpian, De Adulteris, so on the adultery again. In this text, Ulpian explains that those who committed lenocinium, pimping, or performed a so-called ars ludicra lost the ius accusandi, so the right to accuse, the right to act in a trial and accuse another person, and to bring the accusation against another person. In this respect, all these subjects, so the ones who committed lenocinium or performed a so-called ars ludicra, were equated to the bestiari. Again, the bestiari were the people who fought against wild beasts in the arena. The list of persons who lost the ius accusandi also includes those who have been definitely convicted in a judicium publicum, so a criminal trial, a criminal law trial based on the model of the jury courts permanently established by statute. All the subjects mentioned by Ulpian are also named in other texts, and for example in a very famous text, Digest 321, in which the jurist Julian explains that they are all affected by infamia. So all these subjects were affected by infamia. Yeah, you can see the other text, Digest 321. Digest 321 is actually the text that opens the second title of the third book of the Digest, and this title is entitled De is qui notantur infamia, so it has to do with the topic of infamia and the subject who suffered infamia. Yet the fact that a reference to those who fought as gladiators, namely the auctorati, is omitted from both the two sources, again, comes as no surprise. Even if all the other subjects, the ones who performed arts, the artem ludicram, or the lenoni, the ones who committed lenocinium and so on, are mentioned in this text. But again, the reference to the auctorati is omitted. But if the went to perform the ars ludicra, or, for example, the bestiari are mentioned, a fortiori, the auctorati and the gladiators should be included in this list of people who suffered infamia. So one of the consequences of Praetorian infamia consisted in not being entitled to postulare pro aliis, so act in a trial on behalf of others. In the incipit, digest 3116, at the very beginning, again, Ulpian, jurist Ulpian, after listing a series of subjects who did not have the right to postulare pro aliis, so to act in a trial on behalf of others, among whom those who have been punished for a capital crime stand out, then the jurist deals with a person who has rented out his opera to fight wild beasts. Anyone who had rented out his opera to fight wild beasts, of course, in exchange for money, would have been excluded from the jus postulandi pro aliis. And so what we can actually argue is that if we accept that the condition of the auctoratus was harsher from a legal and maybe social perspective than the condition of someone who had rented out his opera to fight wild beasts in the arena, it is possible to conclude that a fortiori the auctoratus himself lost the right to postulare pro aliis. And so there were some other minor consequences. For example, there is an interesting constitution that was enacted by Constantine the Great in 336 AD, and that we can find in the Codex Theodosianus 463. In this constitution, it is possible to read that the lives of gladiators and the lives of the so-called arenari, so all the persons who perform something in the arena, fighting against wild beasts or performing as gladiators or something else, all these subjects had become increasingly despised over time, actually well before the 3rd century AD. It happened well before the 3rd century AD. And in any case, according to the constitution enacted by Constantine the Great in 336 AD, all these people should be separated from anyone belonging to the social rank of the honestiores, so those who had held the higher offices, and therefore the senators, people of equestrian rank, the curiones of the local and provincial elite. And the provision also said that anyone belonging to the social rank of honestiores should not have any family or kinship relationships with such individuals. So, bestiari, gladiators, and so on. And this constitution clearly shows how these kind of subjects were put to the margins of society, even if their performance could be highly appreciated in the arena. So to conclude, without batting an eyelid or complaining, the defeated gladiator had to accept the death blow, ferrum accipere, thereby demonstrating the triumph of Roman virtus over death. A servant dressed as Charon struck the fallen fighter with his hammer, symbolically taking possession of the dead man. The body was then carried out of the arena on a stretcher through the Porta Libitinaria, named after the goddess of death, Libitina, and the next fight could begin after the bloody sand had been cleaned. However, the outcome of the fight was not necessarily linked to the death of one of the gladiators, as there were 4 possible ways to end the fight: death during the fight, surrender with pardon, surrender followed by execution by the opponent, and termination of the fight by a draw, stans, the so-called stans missus. Pardon for a fallen gladiator and dismissal with a draw occurred when the organizer and the audience, and perhaps the emperor, considered that the fighter or fighters had fought bravely, courageously, and with technical skills. Ultimately, what I have attempted to demonstrate is that the munera gladiatoria were not simply an insignificant entertainment for plebeians in either the Roman Republic or the Principate, but rather events that played a central role in Rome's political, legal, and cultural life. At the same time, Gladiators were important figures in Roman society, despite usually being confined to its margin and affected by severe legal disabilities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much for
If you
this
want.
interesting view of the Roman society,
Thank you.
the largeness of Roman society, and I would like to ask the public if they would like to put some questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You have shown very clearly this marginalization of the gladiators, who were very important people because they helped the people to perform very well. So this was also for the authority of the organizer of the gladiatorial games. But I'm working on Suetonius, so I wonder if Suetonius' information that also free citizens killed gladiators, if this is a reliable information or it's due to his rhetorics of defamation of the emperors who forced people to fight gladiators.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, actually, I agree. There is some. Oh, so I would say this information, this specific information by Suetonius, it is relatively reliable, but I compared this information with other information. So I just quoted Suetonius because it came to my mind, fighting virtutis causa and this kind of idea. Of course, there is a kind of propaganda behind this description by Suetonius. So I completely agree with you. I think that if we compare Suetonius with other classical authors, we can think that it is actually true that still at the end of the Republic, perhaps not any longer at the time of at the beginning of the Principate, but still at the end of the Republic, fighting virtutis causa, so fighting for free. In case of noble men, noble young men, of course, could be considered as something that glorified this person and glorified the idea of Rome. Of course, there is some propaganda, and at the same time, I think these kind of cases should not be so frequent. They were not so frequent. Perhaps it happened, or it could happen as, for example, it happened that Caligula decided to fight, of course, and to show that he was a free man who wanted to fight like the ancient Romans did. But of course, it's a kind of impostor. The one by Caligula is a kind of impostor. But I think that the source by Suetonius alone could be not that reliable, but if we compare it with some other sources, we can still rely on that. That's my opinion. Even if it was a very limited case, the case of noble people fighting for free, virtutis causa, I suppose. That's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I wonder, why did they abolish fighting virtutis causa?
I suppose it's. There is something? No. May I answer, or did you want to add something else? No. Sorry. No. Sorry. Thank you. Well, I think it had to do with the development of gladiatorial games. So they changed a bit and switched from the Republic to the Principate. And I don't think they abolished this kind of fightings. Simply, people did not decide to do it again, so to do it any longer. So it was such a mass spectacle, and for example, death and blood were so important to the audience, and I think that organizing this kind of fights, I don't want to say they were abolished, and perhaps they still occurred, but if they occurred, we have no sources testifying it, And in any case, I suppose these kind of spectacles were too big, and by the way, being involved in the spectacle became the reason to suffer infamia. There is a switch, there is a change, in my view. So, gladiatorial games and spectacles and combats were not infamous, were not something bad in at the time of the Republic, when they arrived in Rome. Of course they were not, and also later. But then, somehow, fighting as a gladiator became the reason to suffer infamia, in any case. And that's why free men belonging to noble families decided, well, it's not the case to fight, even if I want to fight virtutis causa, but I will not do it any longer. Because infamia was somehow connected with the status of gladiator. Unless it was the emperor who decided to fight as a gladiator, but that was the exception, of course. That's my view. So it changed. The perception changed for the Romans themselves. And also, if we read the sources, there is a kind of change. So it was something that led to this kind of legal, social disgrace, fighting in the arena. Even if the Romans really loved the gladiatorial spectacles. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the entire lecture. I have two questions, or I have a comment in the question. I think that your opinion regarding to that question is entirely right. And I will just comment on it a little bit. I think if you look at late Republican sources, or let's say late Republican, early Imperial, specifically Sallust, you see in his time a subtle and later on a major shift in perceiving what virtue is. And Sallustius in his prologues pays lots of attention to that. So early Republican virtue, which is very manly, there's a very good book on it by MacDonald that says Roman Virtue and Manliness. So as the complexities of the Roman society evolve, the Roman virtue shifts from this Republican manliness towards, I'm not going to say what, but let's say something else, which, and I'm guessing now, which gradually through the imperial period evolves into not wanting to fight at all, not wanting to participate in the army anymore, right? So that's just my comment, an observation which I think that maybe we are on the same page here. And I have a question, if you will allow it. How deep did you look into Tertullian? I find Tertullian fascinating, but how much of that ranting against gladiators do you think is rhetorical, and how much of it is really honest?
In the Spectaculus, Tertullian.
Yeah.
Well, so thank you very much both for the comment and the question. I agree with you about the comment. I agree with you. There is a swift change. So again, thinking about the military service, there is a completely change. So many mercenaries, so many people. The mercenarius Corax mentioned by Petronius is very poor, and he becomes a mercenarius because he doesn't have any money to live for. So it changes a lot. Even if perhaps the gladiatorial spectacle still represented a way to testify the triumph of Rome, of course, but it's a different idea of virtue. I agree with you. And coming to the question, it's a bit rhetorical. Of course, Tertullian is a bit rhetorical. It's so strong, so the criticism is so strong, so harsh, and he is part of that society. And I mean, there are so many contradictions in that society, not only with regard to the gladiators. There are so many other kind of contradictions. But I think it's a harsh way to criticize Roman society in its classicism. So the classical Roman society, the Roman society that is not Christian somehow. And so I think this is a way of Tertullian to say, well, have a look how the Romans are, so almost like barbarians in their, with regard to this, to the gladiators, because they love them and then they despise them and so on. And it seems like that these Romans had no values. Okay, quanta perversitas. So there is a perversion in the Romans. In the Romans before something. So I think there is propaganda, there is a rhetorical intent. It's pretty clear. But anyway, at the same time, it's interesting to read it, because the criticism is so harsh, of course, and the idea of perversitas. And again, if you think at the time, at Rome, at the time of Tertullian, this is not the only case which we can find kind of perversitas or contradiction. And that's why I find it very interesting, but also not so objective. Thank you very much.
In the literary sources, there is mentioned that in the time of crisis, the Romans, for example, during the Marcomannic Wars, the Romans included the gladiators, slaves in their army. Is this the only case during the Roman history, during the Marcomannic Wars, or there are other cases? And do you know what is then the legal status of these gladiators is probably changed for all the time. Or what do you think?
So thank you very much. I remember, the Historia Augusta, and dealing with Marcus Aurelius, the obsequentes. So all these people taken from different places of gladiators, including gladiators, they became obsequentes because Marcus Aurelius needed people to fight against in the Marcomannic Wars, exactly. For example, or other wars and so on. I don't know whether this is the only case. It's the only that I know. It's the only one that I know, but it's likely there were other cases. I have to be honest, I didn't find any other cases, but it's possible that I simply missed some sources. This is the most the well-known case. I think that, anyway, just guessing, that perhaps it was not the only case, because if we think some other sources, not literary, but some imperial constitutions of the 4th century AD, for example, they talk about people taking the sacramentum militiae, and they talk of people taking the sacramentum militiae, comparing them to the gladiators, to say if gladiators took the oath, they were different than other people who wanted to serve in the army and who took the oath. But this text perhaps mean that there were also gladiators who were in the army, who became military, so just to fight with the Romans. But it's not clear. I mean, it's not said, or it's not openly said in this constitution. So I only guess that it's possible that gladiators were somehow used again after the Marcomannic Wars. That they were forced to serve for the army, in the army. It's something that I guess, because actually I don't have any precise specific idea on that. Just talking now, I just guess that it's possible that we can interpret some of the later constitution, the constitution of the 4th century AD in this way. But the reference to the Marcomannic War is the only reference that I actually precisely know talking about it. So thank you very much. Thank you.
It was in 69 AD.
Under Otto. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the audience, and mainly thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much again for this invitation. Thank you very much. It was a great honor.